An unexpected storm, a lonely balcony in a small abandoned puppy. Margaret, a 72-year-old woman stuck in her quiet routine, never imagined that a wet, four-legged visitor would change everything. This isn't just a story about rescuing a dog. It's about rescuing yourself, finding purpose and discovering that sometimes the biggest transformation starts with the smallest decisions. Stay until the end and prepare to be moved by this journey of love, redemption and new beginnings. The wind blew through the lace curtains in the living room, making them dance gently against the window. Margaret Anderson watched the movement with distant eyes, sitting in her favorite armchair, the same one Henry used to occupy during his long afternoons of reading. 5 years had passed since his departure, but the weight of his absence still hung over the house on Maple Street like a persistent fog. The house, a 2-story Victorian cottage in Winchester, Massachusetts, was kept spotless under Margaret's meticulous care. Every object remained exactly where Henry had left them, his reading glasses still rested on the side table, and his pipe was still in its mahogany holder, although the scent of tobacco had long since dissipated. At 72, Margaret had developed a routine that bordered on ritual. At 6 in the morning, she watered the begonias in the front garden, Henry's favorites. At 7, she made a single cup of coffee and watched the cardinals visiting the bird feeder from the kitchen window. The rest of the day was filled with small household chores, always carried out in the same order, like a solitary dance through the hours. "Good morning, Mr. Cardinal," she murmured to the red bird that landed on the feeder that morning. It was the same one that appeared every day, or at least she liked to think so. His occasional visits provided a comforting sense of continuity in her carefully orchestrated life. The neighbors on Maple Street had already given up trying to include her in their social activities. The gentle knocks on her door gradually diminished over the years, as did the invitations to afternoon teas and book club meetings. Margaret answered them all with polite refusals, until eventually they stopped coming. Mrs. Peterson, from number 43, still waved occasionally from her garden. Margaret reciprocated with a brief nod, but then retreated into the house. She knew what the others thought, that she was hiding, that she needed to move on. But how could she explain that every social interaction seemed to sap a little more of the energy she could barely muster for her daily tasks? That particular afternoon, dark clouds began to form on the horizon. Margaret watched them approach with growing concern. The forecast hadn't mentioned rain. Her eyes roamed the garden, assessing whether the begonias would survive the impending storm. The first clap of thunder reverberated through the neighborhood like a distant roar. Margaret hurried to close the windows, her movements precise and efficient. By the time she reached the last window in the living room, the rain was coming down in thick curtains, turning the street into a gray blur. It was then that she heard it. At first, almost imperceptible under the sound of the storm, a high-pitched, trembling whine, coming from the direction of the balcony. Margaret froze, her hand still on the window handle. The sound came again, clearer this time. Hesitating, she approached the front door. Years of carefully constructed routine had advised her to ignore the noise, to stay safe within her bubble of predictability. But something in that wail, something vulnerable and frightened, echoed in a deep place in her heart that she thought she had silenced long ago. With slightly trembling fingers, Margaret turned the door handle. The cold wind of the storm invaded the entrance hall, bringing with it a few drops of rain. There, huddled against the doorframe, was a small puppy, soaking wet and shivering. Its eyes met hers, big, brown and frightened, and for a moment, Margaret felt something move in her chest, like an old jammed lock starting to come loose. The cub let out another low whimper, as if begging for help. Margaret looked up at the stormy sky, then at the little intruder on her balcony. All her carefully planned routine, all the control she had built up over the years, seemed to be challenged by this tiny creature trembling on her threshold. "Just until the rain clears," she muttered, more to herself than to the puppy, as she slowly bent down to pick it up. The little wet body snuggled instantly against her chest, seeking warmth, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced for a long time, the comforting weight of another living being in her arms. As she closed the door, leaving the storm outside, Margaret couldn't imagine how that seemingly simple decision was about to trigger a series of events that would completely transform her carefully ordered life. For now, there was only the sound of the rain, the warmth of the little body in her arms, and a strange, forgotten feeling beginning to awaken in her heart. Margaret stared at the little invader in her immaculate kitchen, an old towel wrapped around its trembling body. The puppy, for its part, watched her with eyes that seemed too big for its tiny snout, drops of water still dripping from its golden fur. "What now?" she whispered to herself, realizing that she had no idea what to do with a dog. Her last experience with pets had been decades ago, when Henry had insisted on having a cat, an independent animal that barely needed looking after. The clock on the wall read 7:43 p.m., well past the time when she would normally be preparing her evening tea. Instead, there she was, with her sleeves rolled up and water everywhere, trying to dry off a creature that seemed determined to shake itself every few seconds. "Hold still," she ordered, her voice wavering between firmness and pleading as the cub tried to escape for the third time. He responded with a high-pitched bark that echoed through the silent kitchen, startling Margaret. It was the first sound other than her own voice that these walls had heard in months. The storm continued outside, but now its thunder was accompanied by playful little growls as the puppy attacked the end of the towel. Margaret found herself watching his clumsy movements, noticing how his paws seemed too big for his body. "You're going to be a big dog," she thought to herself. After getting him reasonably dry, Margaret faced her next dilemma: food. Her fridge, organized with individual portions meticulously planned for the week, certainly didn't contain anything suitable for a dog. After a few moments of hesitation, she cut a slice from the turkey breast she had set aside for her sandwich the next day. The puppy devoured the meat in seconds, looking forward to more. "That's all for now," Margaret said firmly, although her pleading eyes made her feel a twinge of guilt. Tomorrow we'll see what to do with you." As she washed the dinner dishes, 15 minutes later than usual, Margaret began to plan. First thing in the morning, she would call the local police to report the found dog. Someone was certainly looking for him. Until then, she would need to keep him somewhere safe overnight. The problem solved itself when the puppy, apparently exhausted from his adventures, fell asleep under the kitchen table. Margaret watched his gentle breathing, his little chest rising and falling rhythmically. There was something mesmerizing about the sight, something that kept her sitting at the table long after she had finished her tea. It wasn't until the clock struck 10:15 p.m., 45 minutes after her normal bedtime, that Margaret finally got up to get ready for the night. She improvised a bed for the puppy with old towels in the corner of the kitchen, but as she turned to go upstairs, she heard the sound of paws following her. "No," she said firmly, pointing to the makeshift bed. "You stay here." The kitten sat down on the first step of the stairs, tilting its head slightly to the side. Its big eyes fixed on her with an expression that Margaret would have sworn was pleading. "No," he repeated, with less conviction. A small whimper echoed through the silent house. 15 minutes later, Margaret was in her bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the soft snores of her puppy, who slept curled up on a mat next to her bed. She had given in after his third attempt to climb the stairs alone, fearful that he might hurt himself. "Just tonight," she muttered into the dark room, but something in her tone suggested that she didn't quite believe it herself. The alarm clock would go off at 6 a.m., as usual, but for the first time in years, Margaret wasn't sure what the next day would bring. Her last words before falling asleep were to Henry, as was always part of her nightly ritual: "What would you think of all this, darling?" The silence that followed seemed different this time, less empty, less definitive. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but Margaret could have sworn she felt a smile somewhere in the shadows of the room. The evening progressed, the storm subsided into a gentle drizzle, and for the first time in 5 years, the Andersons' house held more than memories. Upstairs, a 72-year-old woman slept a restless sleep, her worries about broken routines mingling with dreams of brown eyes and wet paws. On the rug next to her bed, a lost puppy dreamed of the warmth of gentle arms and the taste of turkey breast. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night marked the beginning of a transformation that would go far beyond the simple act of sheltering a dog during a storm. For now, there was only the soft sound of 2 rhythmic breaths, filling the empty spaces of a house that had long been waiting for new beginnings. For the first time in 5 years, Margaret woke up before her alarm clock. The sound didn't come from the clock, but from soft scratching on the bedroom door, followed by a low, insistent whine. For a moment, still wrapped in the haze of sleep, she wondered if she was dreaming. Then memories of the night before flooded her mind, the storm, the puppy, her carefully planned routine collapsing like a house of cards. God, she muttered, glancing at the digital clock beside the bed, 5:17 in the morning. The rug where the puppy had slept was empty, and the sounds on the other side of the door were becoming more urgent by the second. Margaret got up, putting on her light blue robe over her nightgown. As she opened the door, she was greeted by a pair of brown eyes and a frantically wagging tail. The puppy lapped excitedly around her feet, as if celebrating its own achievement in waking her up. "I imagine you need—" "Oh, no." The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. A dog would need to go potty, and her meticulously tended garden would be the nearest available place. Descending the stairs faster than she had done in years, Margaret struggled to put on her slippers as the puppy shot ahead of her down the steps in a clumsy but surprisingly agile manner. When she finally managed to open the back door, he was already dancing anxiously back and forth. The morning air was cool and damp after the previous night's storm. Margaret watched helplessly as the little invader circled her daisy bed, sniffing every inch of the soggy soil. To her relief, he chose a grassy corner, away from her most precious flowers. "Good boy," the words escaped her lips before she could contain them, and the puppy responded by running back to her, leaving little muddy footprints all along the way. Margaret sighed, noting the marks on her immaculate floor, one more thing to clean up. As she prepared her breakfast, 10 minutes earlier than usual, Margaret tried to organize her thoughts. She needed to call the police, to see if anyone had reported a lost puppy. But first, the little guest needed to be fed. "I can't keep feeding you turkey," she muttered, watching the puppy who was now exploring the kitchen with renewed interest. "I need to buy you some proper food." The prospect of leaving the house so soon, of interacting with people, made her stomach contract. The small pet store on Main Street would open at 8 a.m., she knew this because she passed it on her rare morning walks. She usually avoided busy times, preferring to do her shopping in the early afternoon, when the streets were emptier. The sound of the doorbell snapped her out of her thoughts, causing her to spill hot water next to her cup of tea. The puppy started barking, running towards the front door. "Shoo!" Margaret tried to silence him, her heart racing. Who could it be at that hour? Mrs. Anderson. The voice of Mrs. Peterson, her neighbor, sounded from the other side of the door. "Sorry to disturb you so early, but I heard barking. Is everything all right?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Normally, she would simply ignore the knock on the door, waiting until the visitor gave up. But the puppy kept barking, denouncing her presence. With hesitant steps, she approached the door. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the handle, opening it just a crack. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," her voice sounded huskier than she had intended. "Oh, my God!" The expression of genuine surprise on her neighbor's face almost made Margaret smile. "You have a dog." The puppy, taking advantage of the ajar door, poked its snout through the gap, making Mrs. Peterson melt into expressions of delight. Actually, Margaret found herself explaining, "I found him yesterday during the storm. I'm trying to find its owners." "How lovely of you to take him in," Mrs. Peterson smiled, and there was something in her expression that made Margaret feel uncomfortably exposed. "You know, my daughter works as a veterinarian at the clinic in town. She could check if he has a microchip." Margaret hesitated. The idea of bad news being delivered by a stranger, of having to interact with people she didn't know. But the puppy needed professional help, and she knew it. That would be useful, she finally replied. Great. I can call her right now. The clinic opens at 9. Mrs. Peterson paused, studying Margaret's face. You know, I was just about to prepare some breakfast. Would you like to come? We can discuss what the little one will need until we find its owners. No was on the tip of Margaret's tongue, her automatic response to any social invitation over the last 5 years. But then the puppy sat down next to her, leaning lightly against her leg, as if giving her support. Margaret looked at the little intruder who was already turning her life upside down, then at Mrs. Peterson's hopeful face. I need to buy some things for him first. Maybe another day. Mrs. Peterson's smile widened, as if Margaret had just accepted the invitation instead of politely declining it. Of course. I'll call Lucy right now about the microchip. And Margaret? She paused meaningfully. It's good to see you again. When Margaret closed the door, her hands were still shaking, but for a different reason. In less than 12 hours, she had spoken more to another person than in the last 3 months combined. The puppy looked at her, wagging its tail as if proud. Don't get too excited, she murmured, but her voice lacked its usual firmness. That doesn't mean you will be. But as she prepared for her first visit to a pet store in decades, Margaret couldn't ignore the little voice in her mind that whispered that maybe, just maybe, some changes wouldn't be so bad. The small pet store on Main Street seemed much larger than Margaret remembered from her hurried passages down the sidewalk. The bell on the door jingled as she entered, announcing her presence in a way that made her want to retreat immediately. The scent of pet food, cleaning products and something indefinably animal enveloped her. Good morning. Welcome to Pet Paradise. A young attendant with purple hair and a warm smile approached. Her badge identified her as Rose. How can I help you? Margaret tightened the strap of her bag, feeling strangely out of place. I need supplies for a puppy. Oh, how wonderful. Where's the little one? Rose asked, her genuine enthusiasm making Margaret feel even more aware of her own hesitation. He's at home. I found him last night, during the storm, Margaret found herself explaining, surprised at her own willingness to share information. Actually, I don't know how long he'll be with me. Rose's smile softened with understanding. I see. Well, let's make sure he has everything he needs while he's in your care. How about we start with the basics? The next 40 minutes were a crash course in puppy care. Margaret found herself absorbing information about different types of food, appropriate teething toys, hygienic mats and a multitude of other items she had never imagined were necessary. And this one is especially good for kittens who are adapting to a new environment, Rose explained, showing a small teddy bear with something she called an artificial heartbeat. It helps to calm them down at night. Margaret looked at the toy, remembering how the cub had sought comfort next to her bed the night before. I'll take it. When she finally left the store, her arms were laden with bags and her purse considerably lighter. Rose had insisted on helping her carry everything to the car, and Margaret surprised herself by thanking her not only for the help, but also for the advice. Come back and tell us how he's settling in. Rose waved from the store door. Margaret nodded automatically, realizing with surprise that the idea didn't seem as scary as it should. The clock struck 8:47 when Margaret parked in front of the Sunshine Valley Veterinary Clinic. Her hands clenched the steering wheel for a moment as she watched people coming and going with their animals. Henry's voice echoed in her memory, "Life doesn't wait for us, Maggie." The interior of the clinic was surprisingly welcoming, with walls in soft shades of blue and photos of happy animals with their families. Lucy Peterson, her neighbor's daughter, was the image of her mother, with the same warm smile and kind eyes. Mrs. Anderson. Mom called me about your little guest, Lucy greeted her warmly. She mentioned that you found him during the storm. Margaret nodded, briefly recounting the events of the night before. Lucy listened attentively, making occasional notes. Well, shall we have a look at him after lunch? That way you have time to pick up the little one and bring him here. We can check for a microchip and do a full checkup. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of unusual activity. Margaret organized the new supplies at home, watching as the puppy investigated each item with infectious curiosity. She caught herself smiling as he began a fierce battle with his new teddy bear. "You need a name," she murmured, watching him. "Even if it's temporary." The cub stopped his play, tilting his head at her as if considering the question. "Buddy," she said softly, the name coming naturally. Henry always said that every dog should be called Buddy. The puppy, Buddy, barked once, as if approving of the choice, before turning his attention back to the bear. In the afternoon, at the veterinary clinic, Margaret held Buddy in her arms while Lucy ran the microchip reader over his body. The device emitted a high-pitched beep. "He's got a chip," Lucy announced, and Margaret felt her heart squeeze unexpectedly. "I'll check the database." While they waited, Lucy carried out a thorough examination on Buddy. "He looks about 3 months old. He's a pure golden retriever, as far as I can see. He's a bit thin, but otherwise healthy." Margaret absorbed the information mechanically, her mind focused on the microchip and what it would mean. Buddy, oblivious to her concerns, licked her cheek happily after the examination. "Mrs. Anderson." Lucy's voice brought her back to the present. "I found the information from the microchip. Buddy belongs to a family that recently moved to Winchester. The Reynolds. In fact, they live just a few blocks from Maple Street." Margaret felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Of course Buddy had a family. She'd known that from the start. So why did the confirmation hurt so much? "They reported him missing yesterday afternoon, before the storm," Lucy continued softly. "I can contact them now, if you like." Buddy snuggled closer into her lap, his little body warm and trusting. In less than 24 hours, he had transformed their silent house into something alive again. He had brought color into their black and white world. "And now?" "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "Please get in touch with them." As Lucy made the call, Margaret looked at Buddy, who was watching her with those big, confident eyes. "You have a family," she whispered to him. "A family that must be missing you." But as the words left her lips, Margaret realized that it wasn't just Buddy who had found something he didn't know he needed during that storm. In just one day, her carefully ordered life had been completely upended, and for the first time in 5 years, the chaos didn't seem so frightening. The waiting room of the veterinary clinic seemed to shrink with every passing minute. Margaret sat rigidly in one of the blue plastic chairs, Buddy sleeping peacefully on her lap, oblivious to the emotional storm raging inside her. Lucy had said that the Reynolds would arrive in 15 minutes. That was 12 minutes ago. The doorbell jingled, and Margaret felt her heart leap. A girl of about 6 came running in, her brown curls swaying with each hurried step. Behind her, a young couple, he with thin-rimmed glasses, she with a gentle face framed by shoulder-length hair. "Buddy!" The girl's joyful cry woke up the puppy, who immediately raised his head. His eyes widened in recognition, and his tail began to thump furiously against Margaret's arm. "Emma, slow down," the woman, Mrs. Reynolds, called softly, but her own eyes were watery at the sight of the puppy. "We don't want to frighten him." Margaret stood up slowly, her legs trembling slightly. Buddy squirmed in her arms, torn between the excitement of seeing his family and a strange sense of loyalty to her. "Mrs. Anderson." Mr. Reynolds approached, holding out his hand. "We're the Reynolds. We can't thank you enough for looking after our Brownie." "Brownie?" Margaret repeated softly, and then she understood. Of course, that was the puppy's real name. Buddy was just a temporary name, as was his presence in her life. "Yes, because of his eyes," Emma explained, approaching cautiously. Can I hold him?" Margaret looked at the girl, her eyes large and hopeful, so like the puppy's, and felt something in her heart break and heal at the same time. Carefully, she knelt down to Emma's height. "Of course you can, darling. He is your puppy, after all." The moment Buddy, Brownie, leapt from her arms into Emma's was like watching a painting being completed. The puppy covered the girl's face with licks as she laughed, a pure, joyful sound that filled the waiting room. "He ran away during our move," Mrs. Reynolds explained, her voice laced with emotion. "We were unloading the boxes and suddenly he just disappeared. We looked everywhere, but with the storm. He appeared on my balcony." Margaret found herself counting, watching Emma and Brownie playing on the floor. "He was soaking wet and shivering." "Where do you live, Mrs. Anderson?" Mr. Reynolds asked. "On Maple Street." "Oh!" Mrs. Reynolds exclaimed. "We moved to Cedar Avenue. We're practically neighbors." Margaret nodded mechanically, her mind wandering to all the bags of puppy supplies in her house. The teddy bear with a heartbeat was still in its packaging, waiting to comfort a puppy who no longer needed it. "Mrs. Anderson bought a lot of things for you, did you know that?" Lucy commented, appearing next to them with a clipboard. Margaret hadn't realized she was still there. "Special food for puppies, toys." "Oh, you needn't have bothered so much," Mrs. Reynolds said, looking genuinely touched. "We can reimburse your expenses, of course." "That's not necessary," Margaret replied quickly. I was happy to help." Emma approached again, holding Brownie. "Thank you for looking after him," she said, her voice small but sincere. "He seems to like you very much." As if to confirm the girl's words, Brownie stretched out in her arms to lick Margaret's face. The simple, affectionate gesture almost broke her carefully maintained composure. "You know," Mrs. Reynolds began, exchanging a meaningful glance with her husband. "We've just moved and we're still adjusting. Emma starts school next week, and we both work. It would be wonderful to have someone reliable around to look after Brownie from time to time." Margaret blinked, unsure if she had understood correctly. "What Mummy means," Emma explained with the direct sincerity of children, "is that you could be Brownie's nanny. That way he won't be alone when I'm at school." Margaret began, but the words failed her. The idea of still being able to see Brownie, of having a purpose beyond her lonely routine. "Think about it," Mr. Reynolds smiled gently. "There's no hurry. And you're always welcome to visit, whatever you decide." As she watched the Reynolds family prepare to leave, Margaret felt something strange on her face. It took her a moment to realize that she was smiling, a genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and warms the heart. "Mrs. Anderson." Emma called from the doorway, Brownie safe in her arms. "Can you come home for dinner sometime? Brownie would like that." "And so would we," Mrs. Reynolds added softly. Margaret looked at that little family, the Reynolds with their warm smiles, Emma with her infectious innocence, and Brownie, who in less than 2 days had redrawn the contours of her carefully ordered world. "I'd love to," she replied, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. When they finally left, Lucy put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You know, Mrs. Anderson, sometimes angels have 4 legs." Margaret nodded, discreetly wiping away a stubborn tear. Outside, the afternoon sun shone through the clouds left over from the storm, creating a faint rainbow on the horizon. It was as if the universe was trying to tell him that sometimes the best things in life start with a storm. The house on Maple Street had returned to its meticulous routine. The clock in the living room continued its steady ticking, the begonias still received water at 6 in the morning sharp, and the red cardinal continued to visit the feeder every morning. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything except Margaret. It had been 3 days since Brownie had returned to her family, and every corner of the house seemed to scream her absence. The bags of puppy supplies remained untouched in the kitchen cupboard. Margaret hadn't had the courage to return them to the store, nor to store them properly. The teddy bear with a heartbeat was still in its original packaging, resting on the kitchen table like an unanswered question. "It's better this way," she muttered into her cup of afternoon tea, as if trying to convince herself. Everything's back to normal. But normal had changed its flavor. The silence, once a comforting blanket, now seemed suffocating. The empty corners of the house, which once represented order and predictability, now seemed just empty. The phone rang, making Margaret jump in her chair. It was 3:47 p.m. Nobody usually called at that time. Her first instinct was to let it ring, as she always did, but something made her reach for the handset. "Hello? Mrs. Anderson?" Emma Reynolds' cheerful voice filled the line. "Mom said I could call to tell you that Brownie misses you. He stares at the door every time he hears a noise, you know." Margaret felt her throat tighten. Is he adjusting well?" "Yes. But he still doesn't like his new bed very much. Mom said it might be because he slept next to you that night." A sudden memory of the warm little body curled up on her mat made Margaret's eyes sting. "Mrs. Anderson?" Emma's voice became softer. "You're still coming to visit, aren't you?" Before Margaret could answer, she heard Mrs. Reynolds' voice in the background. "Emma, dear, remember what we talked about giving Mrs. Anderson time." "But Mom, Brownie misses you." "I'm sorry about that, Mrs. Anderson." Mrs. Reynolds took over the phone. "Emma's very excited about having you around." "No problem," Margaret replied, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Actually, She paused, looking at the teddy bear on the table. "Henry always said that the best decisions in life were the ones that scared you a little. I was wondering," she continued, her heart beating faster, "if the dinner invitation still stands." The smile in Mrs. Reynolds' voice was almost palpable. "Of course it is. How about tomorrow night? Emma will be ecstatic, and Brownie, well, he'll love seeing you." After hanging up the phone, Margaret sat for a long moment, absorbing the weight of her decision. Her gaze wandered around the kitchen, stopping at different points: the spot where Brownie had devoured his first piece of turkey, the corner where he used to sit while she washed the dishes, the back door through which he had left on their first morning together. Getting up, she walked over to the cupboard and picked up the bags of supplies. One by one, she began to organize the items on the table: the premium kitten food, the teething toys, the hygiene mats. Finally, she picked up the teddy bear. "What do you think, Henry?" she asked into the familiar silence. "Am I being silly?" A gentle breeze blew in through the kitchen window, making the curtains dance softly. In the garden, the cardinal landed on the feeder again, the second time in the same day, something that had never happened before. Margaret smiled, remembering Lucy's words at the clinic: "Sometimes angels have 4 legs." Perhaps, she thought, sometimes they also had red feathers. Carefully, she began to gather the items into one large bag. Tomorrow, when she went to dinner with the Reynolds, she would take everything with her. Not because she wanted to get rid of the memories, but because maybe, just maybe, they weren't just memories, but the start of something new. That night, for the first time in 3 days, Margaret didn't double-check that all the doors were locked. She didn't set the thermostat to exactly 70 degrees. She didn't arrange the sofa cushions in perfectly symmetrical angles. Instead, she sat in her favorite armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, brewed 10 minutes later than usual, and allowed herself to dream of a future where silence was no longer her only companion. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the evening sky. The breeze still blew gently through the begonias in the garden, and somewhere on Cedar Avenue, a small golden retriever puppy was probably dreaming of the kind lady who had saved him from the storm. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a different peace from the one she had known for the last 5 years. It was less perfect, less controlled, but somehow more real. As if the universe was telling her that sometimes you have to let order break down a little so that something more beautiful can take its place. Margaret stayed in her parked car for a few minutes, looking at the Reynolds house on Cedar Avenue. It was a traditional 2-story building, with a welcoming veranda and a front garden that still showed signs of recent change. Empty boxes piled up next to the garage, and some gardening tools rested against the white picket fence, as if their owners had been interrupted in the middle of a project. The large bag with the puppy supplies weighed heavily on her lap, as did the apple pie she had decided to bake that afternoon, the first she had made since Henry's death. It was his recipe, in fact, something he used to make on Sunday afternoons. A familiar bark snapped her out of her musings. Brownie had appeared at the living room window, his paws resting on the sill as his tail wagged frantically. Even through the glass, Margaret could see the joy in his eyes. "You can do it," she muttered to herself, picking up her things and getting out of the car. Before she could reach the porch steps, the front door opened and Emma rushed out, closely followed by Brownie, who practically slid on the welcome mat in her haste to get to Margaret. "Mrs. Anderson. You really came!" Emma exclaimed, as Brownie circled Margaret's legs, barking happily. "Emma, let Mrs. Anderson at least come in first." Mrs. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, wearing a floral print apron. The scent of something delicious escaped from the house, some kind of herb roast. "I've brought a few things," Margaret said, trying to keep her balance as Brownie continued his welcome dance. "The supplies I bought for, well. Please come in." Mr. Reynolds appeared at his wife's side. "And is that an apple pie? It looks incredible." The house inside was a charming mix of organization and controlled chaos. Partially unpacked boxes shared space with already arranged furniture, and family photographs were beginning to find their place on the walls. It was a home in the making, full of promise and possibility. "I hope you like lasagna, Mrs. Reynolds. Please call me Charlotte," said as she led Margaret into the kitchen. "It's the specialty of the house. And I helped with the salad," Emma announced proudly, following them with Brownie at her heels. The kitchen was spacious and welcoming, with a central island where plates and cutlery were already arranged. A gentle breeze blew in through the open window, bringing with it the scent of the garden. "Brownie has that same expression he had when he found that piece of turkey in your kitchen," Margaret commented, watching the puppy look expectantly into the oven. "Oh, so that's how you won his heart?" Charlotte laughed. "He's completely driven by his stomach. Just like his father, isn't he, darling?" "Hey, I heard that." "Mr. Reynolds, David, please," protested from the living room, where he was finishing setting the table. The conversation flowed naturally during dinner, much to Margaret's surprise. Emma dominated much of it, sharing stories about her new school and how Brownie had become a celebrity among the neighbors. "And he still sleeps with that teddy bear you brought," Emma revealed between mouthfuls of lasagna. "Mom said it must be because it smells like you." Margaret felt her cheeks blush slightly. "Actually, I never gave him the bear. It's here in the bag." "Oh, the one with the heartbeat?" Charlotte asked. "Emma saw one just like it in the pet store the other day. They're great for cubs who are adjusting." "Maybe." Margaret began, hesitantly. "Maybe he can still use it when he stays here with me. If the invitation still stands, of course." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it seemed like an eternity to Margaret. Then Emma's face lit up like a rising sun. "Are you really going to babysit Brownie?" The girl practically jumped out of her chair with excitement. "That would be wonderful," Charlotte smiled warmly. "Especially now that David's got that new project and I'll be back in the office next week. And I start school on Monday," Emma added. "Brownie would be so lonely." As if understanding that he was the topic of conversation, Brownie approached Margaret, resting his head on her knee and looking at her with those eyes that seemed to understand much more than a puppy should. "You know," David commented, helping himself to another piece of apple pie, "this is the best pie I've ever had." Henry had good taste in recipes. Margaret froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. "How?" "Mrs. Peterson," Charlotte explained softly. "She told us a bit about you and Henry. We hope you don't mind." At other times, Margaret would have felt exposed, vulnerable. But something had changed. Perhaps it was the welcoming warmth of the Reynolds kitchen, or the way Emma looked at her with sincere admiration, or the comforting weight of Brownie's head on her knee. Henry loved to cook, she found herself saying. Especially on Sundays. This pie was his specialty. Tell us more about him. Emma asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. And so, for the first time in 5 years, Margaret allowed herself to talk about Henry without feeling like her heart was being ripped out of her chest. She shared stories about his clumsy attempts at gardening, about how he insisted that every dog should be called Buddy, about his Sunday mornings baking apple pies. The evening progressed like a gentle river, bringing laughter, stories and, to Margaret's surprise, a growing sense of belonging. When she finally said goodbye, it was after 9, well past her usual bedtime. Monday, then? Charlotte confirmed as she walked her to the door. Emma leaves for school at 7:30, and Brownie loves a morning walk. Monday, Margaret agreed, and the word sounded like a promise. On the way home, Margaret realized she couldn't stop smiling. Her carefully ordered world was changing, expanding to include joyful barking, children's laughter and dinners that went beyond the planned schedule. And for the first time in a long time, the change didn't seem frightening. It felt right. Monday dawned with a particular clarity in Winchester. Margaret woke up even before her alarm clock, something that had become a habit since the night of the storm. It was 5:45 when she came downstairs, dressed in a set of comfortable pants and blouse that she had picked out especially for the occasion, appropriate clothes for walking an energetic puppy. "First time in years I've worn gym pants, Henry," she muttered to the portrait on the living room wall, adjusting the small fanny pack in which she kept plastic bags and dog treats. She could have sworn that his smile in the portrait seemed wider today. At 7:15, Margaret parked in front of the Reynolds house. The sound of her car had barely ceased when the front door opened, revealing Emma already in her new school uniform, backpack on her back, and Brownie jumping around her in excited circles. "Mrs. Anderson." Emma waved energetically. "You're early." "I thought I'd follow the morning routine," Margaret replied, climbing the porch steps. "To better understand how Brownie likes things." Charlotte appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee and a work folder. "Margaret, I'm so glad you're here. Come in, please. The coffee's fresh." The Reynolds kitchen was in full organized morning chaos. David was preparing sandwiches for Emma's lunch while trying to knot his own tie. Charlotte alternated between sipping her coffee and checking documents in her briefcase. Emma, sitting at the kitchen island, devoured her cereal while animatedly explaining the day's schedule to Margaret. "And sometimes Brownie tries to eat my homework, but now he'll have you to play with, so maybe he'll stop, huh?" The girl finished her explanation breathlessly. "Emma, finish your breakfast," Charlotte gently reminded. "The bus arrives in 15 minutes. Margaret watched everything with a mixture of fascination and nostalgia. There was something deeply comforting about the energy of a family getting ready for the day, something she had forgotten she missed. "Here's the spare key," Charlotte handed Margaret a key ring with a small decorative bone on it. "The list of emergency numbers is on the fridge, including the vet. Brownie's already had breakfast, but he likes a snack around 2 o'clock, Margaret added with a small smile. "I remember." Charlotte paused for a moment, returning the smile with understanding. "Of course you do. You practically wrote Brownie's care manual that first day." The sound of the school bus horn broke the moment. Emma jumped up from her chair, hugging Brownie tightly before running for the door. She only stopped for a second to give Margaret a surprise hug. "Take good care of him, okay?" she whispered before running off. The next few minutes were a quick sequence of goodbyes, with David and Charlotte also leaving for work. Suddenly, the house was silent, except for the sound of Brownie's paws on the wooden floor as he followed Margaret through the kitchen. "Well, it's just the two of us now," she said, and Brownie tilted his head as if considering the situation. "How about that walk?" The park at the end of Cedar Avenue was a little green oasis in the middle of the suburbs. Margaret had never paid much attention to it before, but now, with Brownie gently pulling the guide, she was beginning to notice its details: the wooden benches strategically positioned under leafy trees, the small pond where ducks swam lazily, the manicured beds of wild flowers. "Mrs. Anderson." A familiar voice called out. Rose, the pet sales clerk, was sitting on one of the benches, a book on her lap and an older golden retriever lying at her feet. So the rumors were true. Rumors? Margaret asked, allowing Brownie to guide her to the bench. "About you being the new nanny for the little fugitive here," Rose smiled. "Winchester is a small town, news travels fast. This is Max," she petted the dog at her feet. "He practically grew up in the store, now he's my morning reading companion." Brownie and Max greeted each other politely, and were soon playing in the grass like old friends. Margaret found herself sitting next to Rose, watching the two dogs. "You know," Rose commented after a moment, "Max was also an unexpected gift from the universe. He turned up on the store doorstep 8 years ago, drenched in rain. It seems that best friends always arrive on stormy days." Margaret watched Brownie, now rolling in the grass with total abandon, his golden fur glistening in the morning sun. "Yes, I guess so." The rest of the morning passed in a pleasant blur of activity. Margaret and Brownie established their own routine: after the park, a walk around the block, then back to the Reynolds house where she read a book while Brownie took her morning nap. In the afternoon, they played a bit of fetch in the backyard, and Margaret found she could still laugh, a real, heartfelt laugh, when Brownie decided it was more fun to hide the ball than to bring it back. At 3:30 p.m. Emma returned from school, bursting with stories about her first day. Margaret prepared to leave, but was persuaded to stay for a snack: freshly baked cookies that Charlotte had left ready in the fridge. "You'll be back tomorrow, won't you?" Emma asked as Margaret said goodbye. "I will," Margaret replied, and for the first time in years, she was genuinely looking forward to the next day. Driving home, Margaret realized that she hadn't checked the time once all day. Her meticulously timed routine had been replaced by something more organic, more alive. And surprisingly, the world hadn't fallen apart because of it. On her balcony, the red cardinal was waiting for her at the feeder, as if he wanted to hear the stories of her day. Margaret stopped to watch him, noticing how the late afternoon colors made his red seem even more vibrant. "It's been a good day," she said to the bird, to Henry, to herself. And for the first time in a long time, the words rang completely true. October mornings in Winchester brought with them a particular freshness, and the trees in the park were beginning to tint themselves in shades of red and gold. Margaret adjusted her scarf as she watched Brownie and Max playing among the fallen leaves, a scene that had become part of her daily routine in recent weeks. "So," Rose commented, blowing on the surface of her coffee to cool it down, "have you considered my suggestion?" Margaret gripped her own cup tighter, feeling the warmth through her woolen gloves. "I don't know, Rose. Looking after Brownie is one thing, but other animals—" "Margaret," Rose interrupted gently, "you're already doing that. The only difference is that now people are willing to pay for the service." It was true. Over the last few weeks, what had started out as casual encounters in the park had turned into something more. First it was Mrs. Chen, who needed someone to look after her poodle, Machi, during a business trip. Then the Ramirezes asked for help with their cats while they remodeled their kitchen. Even Mrs. Peterson had asked for his help with her new Labrador puppy. "Lucy says you're a natural," Rose continued. "She's never seen the animals in the clinic as calm as when you're around." The comment made Margaret smile, remembering her last visit to the veterinary clinic. She had accompanied Emma and Brownie for their annual vaccination, and ended up helping to calm a particularly nervous cat in the waiting room. "Besides," Rose added with a mischievous smile, "you already have a loyal customer. Don't you, Charlotte?" Margaret turned to see Charlotte Reynolds approaching along the park path, dressed in her business suit but carrying a dog collar. "I was expecting to find you here," Charlotte smiled, taking a seat on the bench next to Margaret. "Actually, I came to ask a special favor. Is something wrong with Brownie?" Margaret asked, immediately worried. "Oh, no, he's fine. Actually," Charlotte paused meaningfully, "it's about Christmas. David and I were planning to take Emma to visit her grandparents in Vermont, but Brownie can't go," Margaret added, already familiar with David's parents' strict rules about animals in the house. "Exactly. It would only be 5 days, but I completely understand if it's too much to ask." "I'll look after him," Margaret replied without hesitation, surprising herself with the speed of her response. Charlotte's smile widened. "You're an angel, Margaret. Emma will be much calmer knowing that he'll be with you." Rose cast a meaningful glance at Margaret. "See, you're practically a pro now." That afternoon, while Margaret was organizing her diary, something she had started to do since the requests to look after animals had started to increase, the phone rang. It was Lucy Peterson. "Mrs. Anderson. Sorry to bother you, but we have a situation at the clinic. A couple needs someone to make home visits to their elderly golden retriever while they work. I immediately thought of you." Margaret looked at her diary, then at the photo of Henry on the wall. "What's the story?" "His name is Charlie, he's 12 years old and has arthritis. He needs company and help with medication during the day. The owners are willing to pay good money, but the most important thing is to find someone who really cares." The description struck a chord with Margaret. "Can I meet him first?" "Of course. In fact, they could bring Charlie to the clinic tomorrow, when you come with Brownie for your monthly checkup." After hanging up, Margaret realized that her life had changed so gradually and yet so completely that she hardly recognized her routine from just 2 months ago. Her diary was now filled with the names of animals and their owners, schedules for walks and visits, notes about preferences and special needs. The sound of small paws on the balcony brought her back to the present. Brownie was in his characteristic pose, sitting patiently waiting for afternoon snack time, a habit they had developed together. "You know what?" Margaret said as she opened the door. "I think it's time to turn this hobby into something more." Brownie tilted her head, her eyes as attentive as ever. "What do you think about helping me look after other friends like you?" Brownie's excited bark seemed answer enough. That evening, after Emma came to collect Brownie, Margaret sat down at her desk for the first time in years. The notebook that Henry had always encouraged her to use for her big plans was still there, its blank pages waiting patiently. Carefully, she wrote on the first page, "Margaret's Pet Sitting Services." Below, she began to list ideas: home visits, personalized walks, special care for elderly pets or those with specific needs. The red cardinal landed on her feeder, even though it was late at night, something that had never happened before. Margaret smiled at him through the window. "You think it's time too, don't you?" And so, one October evening, as the golden leaves danced outside her window, Margaret Anderson began to plan her next chapter. It wasn't just about caring for animals, she realized. It was about caring for hearts, both four-legged ones and the humans who loved them. On the wall, Henry's photo seemed to smile approvingly, as if to say that sometimes the best plans in life are the ones that find us when we least expect them. The first week of December brought with it not only the promise of snow, but also a subtle transformation in Margaret's house. For the first time in 5 years, a modest Christmas tree occupied the corner of the living room, decorated with soft lights and a few ornaments that Emma had insisted on helping to hang. On the windowsill, small white lights twinkled, reflecting off the snow that was beginning to accumulate outside. "Your first official client arrives in 10 minutes, Margaret murmured to her reflection in the hall mirror, adjusting the freshly printed badge Rose had helped her create. Margaret's Pet Care shone in gold letters against the white background, accompanied by a small stylized paw. Charlie, the elderly golden retriever Lucy had mentioned, would be her first official client apart from Brownie. Her test visits over the last few weeks had been a success, with Charlie responding surprisingly well to her calm and patient presence. The sound of a car parking brought her out of her thoughts. Through the window, she saw the Winters helping Charlie out of the back seat, their gait slow but dignified in the thin snow. "Good morning." Margaret opened the door before they had even rung the bell. Charlie immediately limped towards her, his grey muzzle searching for affection. "He couldn't wait to come," Mrs. Winters smiled, handing Margaret a bag with medication and instructions. "Ever since he started the test visits, he's been anxious every morning, waiting for the time to come here." The arrangement was perfect. Charlie would spend the mornings with Margaret while the Winters worked, keeping Brownie company during his daily visits. The two dogs had developed an unlikely friendship. Charlie's quiet energy seemed to calm Brownie's exuberance, while the puppy's playfulness brought a youthful sparkle to the older dog's eyes. "Ready for your spa day, Charlie?" Margaret joked, gently guiding him inside. In the living room, a new orthopedic bed awaited him, strategically placed near the heater, an investment Margaret had made especially for her new client. The morning passed quietly. Charlie slept in his new bed while Margaret organized her growing schedule. As well as him and Brownie, she now had regular appointments with Machi, the Chen's poodle, and the Ramirez's cats. Lucy had also mentioned 2 more potential clients for January. At 10:30, Brownie's noisy arrival broke the silence. Emma had insisted on dressing him in a red Christmas sweater, complete with little bells that jingled with every movement. "Mrs. Anderson." Emma came bouncing in, carrying a decorated box. "Mom asked me to deliver this. It's Brownie's things for when we go away." Margaret accepted the box, noting the meticulous list attached to the lid: daily routine, food preferences, favorite toys. Although she already knew every detail by heart, Charlotte's care touched her. "And this," Emma continued, pulling something out of her bag, "is for your tree." It was a handmade ornament, a picture of Brownie in a frame decorated with glitter and little paw prints. On the back, in careful childish handwriting, was written, "For Mrs. Anderson, from her furry family, and human too." Margaret felt her eyes water. "It's beautiful, Emma. Shall we hang it together?" As she helped Emma find the perfect place on the tree, Margaret noticed how her living room had changed. It wasn't just the Christmas decorations, it was the energy in the room. Where once there had been silence, now there was the sound of paws on the wooden floor, the soft tinkling of Christmas bells on Brownie's sweater, Charlie's gentle snoring in his new bed. "Mrs. Anderson." Emma's voice brought her back to the present. "Are you going to be lonely at Christmas? You know, when we're traveling?" Margaret looked around, at Charlie sleeping peacefully, at Brownie playing with her new Christmas toy, at the photos that now decorated her walls, some of them showing moments with the Reynolds, others with her new furry clients. "Actually, Emma, I think this will be my least lonely Christmas in a long time." That afternoon, after Emma had left and Charlie had been picked up by the Winters, Margaret sat in her armchair with a cup of tea. Her new notebook was full of plans for the coming year, ideas for expanding her services, notes on the preferences of each animal, even sketches for a possible website that Rose had offered to help create. The cardinal, his old friend, landed on the snow-covered feeder, its vibrant red contrasting with the winter white. Next to it, to Margaret's surprise, landed a second cardinal. "Look at that, Henry," she whispered to the picture on the wall. "It seems that even cardinals don't want to be alone at Christmas." The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Charlotte, calling to confirm the last details of the trip and to thank her once again for looking after Brownie. "You know," Charlotte commented at the end of the call, "Emma said something interesting last night. She said that Brownie didn't just find a babysitter that stormy night, he found a grandmother." Margaret felt her heart expand with a warmth that no heater could provide. After hanging up, she walked over to the Christmas tree and gently touched the ornament Emma had made. "Furry family, and human too." The words seemed to glow in the light of the little bulbs. Outside, the snow was starting to fall harder, but inside Margaret's house, the warmth of a new kind of family, one she had never expected to meet, kept the winter chill at bay. Christmas Eve dawned with a gentle snowfall in Winchester. Margaret woke to the familiar sound of Brownie scratching at her door, a habit he kept up even during his temporary stays. As she opened her eyes, she realized that this would be the first time in 5 years that she wouldn't wake up alone at Christmas. "Good morning, little one," she smiled, opening the door to find not only Brownie, but also Charlie, who had joined them for the festivities. The Winters were visiting their daughter in hospital. She had given birth prematurely the week before, and Margaret had offered to look after Charlie during the holiday. The kitchen was soon filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and Christmas cookies, a special recipe that Margaret had dug out of her old cookbook. While the dough rested, she organized the presents under the tree, new toys for Brownie and Charlie, small packages for their other regular customers who would be visiting later. The phone rang at 9:30, it was Emma, calling from Vermont. "Mrs. Anderson. You have to see how much snow there is here. Is Brownie behaving himself? Did he eat the special Christmas cookie I left for him?" Margaret laughed, watching the puppy who, at that very moment, was trying to persuade Charlie to play with his new stuffed pig. "He's being a perfect gentleman. And yes, he loved his cookie. How nice. Mom wants to talk to you. Margaret?" Charlotte's voice sounded warm even through the phone. "How are things?" "Wonderful. In fact, we're getting ready for a little celebration here." It was true. What had started out as a simple idea had turned into something bigger when Rose had suggested a Christmas pet gathering earlier in the week. Now Margaret was expecting several of her regular clients for an afternoon of socializing. "Lucy told me about the party," Charlotte said. "Looks like you've revolutionized Christmas in Winchester." At 2 in the afternoon, Margaret's house was unrecognizable. Mrs. Chen arrived with Machi, who wore an elegant red bow. The Ramirezes brought their cats in their transport boxes decorated with Christmas ribbons. Rose appeared with Max, carrying a tray of bone-shaped cookies she had made especially for the occasion. Lucy passed quickly between her appointments at the clinic, bringing a surprise, a photo album documenting the first few months of Margaret's pet care, including that first picture of Brownie soaking wet on her balcony. "I thought you might like to have these memories recorded," Lucy smiled, handing over the album. The living room, once so quiet, was now bursting with life. Brownie and Max ran around in playful circles, occasionally stopping to check on Charlie, who watched everything from his privileged bed with serene dignity. Machi, after an initial hesitation, decided that the rug by the fireplace was the perfect place for a festive nap. Even the Ramirez cats, normally so reserved, emerged from their boxes to cautiously explore their surroundings. "Henry would have loved this," Margaret commented softly to Mrs. Peterson, who had arrived with a platter of her famous Christmas pudding. "He's loving it, dear," Mrs. Peterson replied, gently squeezing her arm. "I'm sure he is." As the afternoon progressed, Margaret realized that she had created something much bigger than a simple pet-sitting service. There, in her living room decorated with Christmas lights and full of laughter, both human and animal, a community had been born. Rose was right when she said that the best families sometimes arrived on stormy days. That rainy night that had brought Brownie to her porch hadn't just changed her life, it had created waves that continued to expand, touching other lives, connecting lonely hearts, building bridges between neighbors who had barely known each other before. When the last guest left, it was already evening. The snow had stopped and the full moon bathed the garden in silver light. Margaret was tidying up the kitchen when she noticed something through the window. On the feeding trough, illuminated by the glow of the Christmas lights, there were not just 2, but 3 cardinals. "Look at that," she whispered to Brownie and Charlie, who were resting next to the heater. "It looks like our family keeps growing." That night, as she prepared for bed, Margaret leafed through the album Lucy had given her. Each picture told a story: Brownie on her first walk, Charlie discovering his new bed, Machi learning to trust her, the Ramirez cats finally allowing her to stroke them. And in each image, Margaret could see herself changing, growing, coming back to life. On the last page of the album, Lucy had written a message: sometimes, in helping others find their home, we discover the true meaning of our own. Margaret fell asleep to the sound of the soft bells of Brownie's Christmas sweater, which he insisted on wearing even to bed, and Charlie's gentle snoring. For the first time in many years, his dreams were not about what he had lost, but about everything he had found. The first night of January brought with it a storm that was very reminiscent of the one that had changed everything 6 months ago. Margaret was in her armchair, watching the snowflakes dance under the streetlights, waiting for the Reynolds to return from their trip to Vermont. Brownie, who had been a constant companion during Christmas week, was lying at his feet, still wearing the festive sweater Emma had insisted he keep. Next to him, Charlie was resting in his orthopedic bed. The Winters had asked him to stay another night, as the newborn baby needed some extra care in hospital. The sound of an approaching car made Brownie raise his head, his ears alert. Seconds later, headlights illuminated Margaret's driveway. "They're here," she smiled, and Brownie was already at the door, her tail wagging so hard that the bells on her sweater created a little belated Christmas symphony. Emma was the first out of the car, running through the snow oblivious to Charlotte's protests about her half-open coat. "Mrs. Anderson. Brownie. We've missed you so much." Margaret opened the door, and the warmth of her home welcomed the Reynolds family like a hug. Emma immediately threw herself into her arms, while Brownie circled everyone in a dance of joy. "I hope he wasn't too much trouble," David commented, hefting the travel bags. "Actually," Margaret replied, helping Emma out of her snow-covered coat, "he helped me more than I could have imagined." Charlotte looked around the room, noticing the subtle changes: new photographs on the walls, Charlie's bed near the heater, toys organized in a colorful basket, the pet sitting schedule open on the coffee table. "Looks like you had a busy Christmas here," she smiled. "Oh, you wouldn't believe it," Emma exclaimed, already kneeling down to greet Charlie. "Mrs. Peterson told me all about the pet party. Why didn't we think of it before we left?" Margaret served hot chocolate to everyone, a new tradition she had started in the afternoons with her furry clients and their owners. As the family settled into their living room, sharing stories of the trip and hearing about Christmas adventures in Winchester, she found herself observing how her house had changed. Where once there had been silence, now there was the sound of laughter, the clinking of cups, the soft patter of paws on the wooden floor. The walls that had once witnessed only her loneliness now held memories of joy and connection. "Mrs. Anderson," Emma called out, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Can I show you something I did in Vermont?" The girl ran to her backpack and came back with a drawing. On it, a figure that clearly represented Margaret was surrounded by various animals: Brownie, Charlie, Machi, the Ramirez cats, and others she cared for regularly. At the top, in colorful letters, was written, "Mrs. Anderson's Furry Family." "Grandma said that family doesn't have to have the same blood," Emma explained, her eyes twinkling. "She said that family is what makes our hearts warm, even when it's snowing outside." Margaret felt her eyes water. "Your grandmother is a very wise woman, Emma." A distant clap of thunder made everyone look at the window. The snow had turned to rain, just like that night 6 months ago. "I think it's time we went," Charlotte said softly. "It's getting late, and Emma has school tomorrow." As the family prepared to leave, Brownie hesitated in the doorway, looking from Margaret to Emma, as if trying to understand why he couldn't stay in both places. "It's okay, buddy," Margaret knelt down to hug him. "You'll see me tomorrow morning." "Actually," David interjected, "we'd like to make a change to the arrangement, if you agree." Margaret felt her heart squeeze. Didn't they need her anymore? "We thought that instead of Brownie coming here," Charlotte continued, "perhaps you could spend more time at our house. The guest room is practically empty, and Emma always says it would be more fun if you could stay for dinner. Like a real grandmother," Emma added, jumping up and down with excitement. Margaret looked at the family in front of her, Emma with her hopeful smile, Charlotte and David with their kind looks, Brownie with his divided loyalty but multiplied love. Then she looked at her own home, which had been transformed from a sanctuary of solitude into a center of connection and love. "I'd love to," he replied, and the words carried the weight of all the changes that a single stormy night had unleashed. After the Reynolds left, Margaret returned to her armchair. Charlie had fallen asleep, and outside, the rain was beginning to give way to soft snow again. In the feeder, illuminated by the porch light, the three cardinals snuggled together, braving the cold in community. "You were right all along, Henry," she whispered to the picture on the wall. "Life really doesn't wait for us." Picking up her diary, Margaret began to plan the following week: home visits, walks in the park, the socializing sessions she had started organizing for her Shire clients. Her life, once so carefully contained, now overflowed with possibilities. The last thunder of the night echoed in the distance, but Margaret didn't shrink back as she usually did. Now she knew that sometimes storms didn't come to disturb our peace, but to show us a different kind of peace, one that didn't come from silence and solitude, but from love and connection. And as the snow covered Winchester in its white blanket, Margaret Anderson, once known only as the lonely widow of Maple Street, fell asleep in her armchair, her heart warmed by the certainty that she had found not just a new purpose, but a new way of loving. A way that didn't replace what she had lost, but expanded her heart to welcome even more love. In the end, it wasn't just Brownie who found a home that stormy night, it was Margaret who rediscovered the true meaning of home.